Mister, you look lonely. Here, you can hold Nunu. She always makes me feel better. Maybe she'll help you feel better too.
For 7 long years, Korea's most feared mafia boss hadn't smiled. Not once. His enemies feared him. His allies respected him. Even the people who had worked beside him for a decade couldn't remember what his smile looked like. But on one ordinary afternoon in a quiet public garden, something impossible happened. A 6-year-old girl walked straight up to the most dangerous man in Seoul, and without a word of introduction, placed her most precious possession into his hands. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't even whole. It was a broken wooden rabbit with one front leg missing. And that small, imperfect gift was about to keep a promise this man had failed to keep for 7 long years, and it was about to change 4 lives forever. Stay with me until the end, because what this little girl doesn't know is that she just walked into the life of a man who buried his own daughter, and she's about to bring him back from the dead. Before we begin, if you've ever believed that healing can come from the smallest, most unexpected places, type Nunu in the comments below, and let's begin. In a small rented apartment on the outskirts of Seoul, 6-year-old Do-hyun sat cross-legged on the floor, watching her mother's hands move with practiced patience over a block of pale wood. Han Jae-woo worked 2 jobs, mornings at a laundromat, evenings cleaning offices downtown. But she never let a week pass without carving something for her daughter. Tonight, under the dim yellow light of their single lamp, a rabbit was taking shape. Long ears, a round little body, 2 front paws pressed together as if in prayer. "Is it for me, Mommy?" Do-hyun asked, though she already knew the answer. She asked every time anyway because she loved hearing her mother say yes. "Who else would it be for?" Jae-woo smiled, blowing a curl of wood shavings off her daughter's nose. "But you have to name her yourself. A toy without a name is just wood." Do-hyun studied the little rabbit for a long moment, turning it over in her small hands, tracing the soft curve of its ears. "Nunu," she finally announced, as if she'd known it all along. "Because her eyes look like they're always smiling. None means eyes, right, Mommy?" "That's right, my clever girl." Jae-woo pulled her daughter into her lap and pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Nunu it is." From that night on, Nunu never left Do-hyun's side. She carried it to the market, tucked it beside her pillow, whispered secrets to it before falling asleep. When the other children in the building asked to hold it, she'd shake her head and hug it tighter. "She's mine," she'd say, not unkindly, just certain, the way only a child can be certain of something. Every morning before kindergarten, Do-hyun lined Nunu up on the windowsill so it could watch her leave. And every afternoon she ran the last stretch home just to tell it about her day. She gave it a seat at their small dinner table, propped against the salt shaker, and insisted her mother greet it before either of them sat down to eat. Jae-woo indulged all of it, setting a chopstick's worth of rice beside the rabbit some nights just to see her daughter's face light up. It cost her nothing, and it seemed to cost Do-hyun's heart everything good in the world. Weeks later, on an evening much like any other, Do-hyun was spinning in circles across the living room floor, Nunu clutched triumphantly above her head like a trophy. Jae-woo turned from the stove just in time to see her daughter's foot catch the leg of their old wooden stool. It toppled. Do-hyun yelped and stumbled, and Nunu flew from her hands and hit the floor with a hard, hollow thud. Jae-woo was at her daughter's side in an instant, hands running over small arms and legs. "Are you hurt? Do-hyun, look at me, are you hurt anywhere?" "I'm okay, Mommy." Do-hyun's eyes were already elsewhere, scanning the floor in a panic. "Nunu, where's Nunu?" They found the rabbit near the leg of the stool. One of its front legs had snapped clean off, the break pale and splintered against the wood's dark varnish. Jae-woo's stomach dropped. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm so sorry. I'll carve you a new one this weekend, I promise. I'll make it even prettier." But Do-hyun was already cradling the broken rabbit against her chest, rocking it gently the way her mother rocked her when she had a nightmare. "It's okay, Mommy," she said softly. "Nunu just has an ouchie now. I still love her the same." Jae-woo watched her daughter in stunned silence, something aching and tender rising in her chest. Somewhere in this cramped apartment, on nothing but love and second-hand furniture, she had raised a child with more grace than most adults she knew. That night, after Do-hyun had fallen asleep with Nunu tucked under her chin, Jai-woo sat at the small kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold in her hands. She thought about her daughter's words, "I still love her the same," and wondered, not for the first time, where a 6-year-old learned to forgive so easily when the world had given her so little to be generous with. She thought, too, of Seo-yeon's father, who had walked out before their daughter's first birthday and never once looked back. She had built this small life alone, 2 jobs, 1 bedroom, a lamp that flickered when the wind blew too hard against the window, and some nights the loneliness of it pressed down on her chest until she could barely breathe. But then Seo-yeon would say something like tonight, something so purely kind it startled her, and Jai-woo would remember exactly why she kept going. "Whatever you become," she whispered toward her sleeping daughter's door, "don't ever lose that heart of yours." Across the city, in a mansion so quiet it might as well have been abandoned, Kang Do-hyun sat alone in his study long after the household had gone to sleep. He was a man other men crossed streets to avoid, the head of Seoul's most powerful organization, a name spoken in hushed voices in boardrooms and back alleys alike. His enemies called him ruthless. His men called him fair. No one who worked for him had seen him smile in 7 years, and most had stopped expecting to. What none of them knew, what only his wife carried with him, was the small grave on a hillside outside the city, and the little girl who used to run through these very halls before illness took her at the age of 6. Her name had been Ha-yoon, and in her final days, weak and pale in a hospital bed too big for her small body, she had reached for her father's hand and whispered the only thing she asked of him.
Daddy, promise me you'll keep smiling.
I promise, Ha-yoon.
"Daddy, promise you'll smile again. Promise me you won't be sad forever." He had promised. He had held her hand and promised with his whole broken heart. And then he had buried her, and buried the promise right along with her, because it turned out to be the one vow in his entire ruthless, disciplined life that he could not keep. 7 years passed. He ran his empire with the same cold precision as ever. Men who crossed him disappeared from the city's business without explanation. Men who served him loyally were rewarded without ever seeing him raise his voice, let alone his hand. He was, by every account, exactly the kind of man his enemies feared, and his allies depended on: controlled, exact, untouchable. But control, it turned out, was not the same as peace. He came home each night to the same silent halls, ate dinner across from a wife who tried, and failed, and tried again to reach whatever part of him had closed the day their daughter died. He would sit in his study long after Seo-yeon had gone to bed, staring at nothing in particular, and somewhere behind his ribs, a small voice kept asking why he still hadn't smiled. His men had a name for it quietly, among themselves. They called him the Winter Boss because nothing about him ever seemed to thaw. He knew what they called him. He had never once corrected it. That same week, in a conference room 20 floors above the city, Do-hyun sat across from a business partner who had quietly skimmed profits from a shared venture for the better part of a year. The man sweated through his explanation, offering excuses that grew more elaborate with every passing minute. Do-hyun said nothing until the man finally ran out of words. "You didn't need to lie to me," Do-hyun said at last, his voice perfectly even. "You only needed to ask. I would have said no, and that would have been the end of it. Instead, you've made this complicated." He closed the folder in front of him without raising his voice. "I don't deal in complications." The man left the building considerably poorer and considerably more careful. Do-hyun's assistant, waiting outside, noted, as he always did, that his employer hadn't blinked, hadn't raised a hand, hadn't needed to. Fear didn't require volume when it was built on 7 years of unbroken precedent. Do-hyun rode home in silence that evening, staring out at the city lights sliding past the car window, and felt, as he often did after such meetings, nothing at all. Not satisfaction, not guilt, just the familiar, hollow competence of a man who had gotten very good at a life he no longer remembered choosing. Some weeks later, Do-hyun found himself sitting on a bench in a public garden downtown, waiting for a business associate who was already 20 minutes late. He didn't mind. The garden was quiet at this hour, and quiet was the closest thing to peace he allowed himself these days. He didn't notice the little girl until she was already standing in front of him. She couldn't have been older than 6, in a faded yellow dress, her hair pulled into 2 uneven pigtails. She was studying him with the unguarded curiosity only children possess, the kind of stare adults are trained out of. "Mister," she said, "you look lonely." Do-hyun blinked. His bodyguards, stationed a discreet distance away, tensed but didn't move. Children were, after all, no threat to a man like him. "I'm fine," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. The girl didn't seem convinced. She reached into the small bag slung across her body and, without a moment's hesitation, pulled out a wooden rabbit, one front leg missing. Its wood worn smooth from small, loving hands, and held it out to him. "Here," she said simply. "You can hold Nunu. She always makes me feel better." Do-hyun stared at the little wooden thing sitting in her outstretched palms, and for reasons he could not have explained to a single living soul, his hands moved before his mind caught up, and he accepted it. The girl beamed, satisfied, as if she'd completed an important mission. Then she turned and ran back across the garden to where a young woman, her mother, clearly, given the shape of her eyes, was waving her over with an apologetic smile toward Do-hyun's direction. He sat there long after they had gone, the broken rabbit resting in his palm, its worn wooden eyes seeming to look up at him with something disturbingly close to warmth. He took it home. He told no one. But for 3 nights running, he found himself unable to sleep, drawn instead to sit alone in his study with the little rabbit set on the desk before him, staring at it as though it might explain itself. On the first night, he told himself it was simply curiosity, an odd object that had crossed his path, nothing more. He turned it over in his hands, studying the small, careful knife marks along its ears, the smooth wear where a child's thumb had clearly rubbed the same spot 1,000 times over. Someone had made this with love. Someone small had loved it back just as fiercely. On the second night, he found himself thinking of Ha-yoon's room down the hall, untouched for 7 years, her own toys still arranged exactly as she'd left them. He hadn't gone in there in longer than he could admit. He wondered, staring at the broken rabbit, whether the little girl in the garden had any idea what she'd handed him, or whether she'd simply seen a lonely man and acted on the uncomplicated instinct children hadn't yet been taught to suppress. By the 3rd night, he'd stopped pretending it was curiosity at all. On the 4th night, his wife, Yoon Si-hwa, woke to an empty bed and went looking for him. She found him in his study, bathed in moonlight, eyes fixed on the small broken toy. Do-hyun, she crossed the room and sat beside him, her hand finding his. "You've barely slept all week. What is it?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a voice she hadn't heard from him in years, soft, unguarded, almost boyish, he told her about the garden, about the little girl who had looked at a man 300 people feared and simply decided he looked lonely, about the broken rabbit she'd pressed into his hands like it was nothing at all, and everything. Si-hwa listened without interrupting, her chest tightening with an emotion she hadn't let herself feel in years, hope. She had watched her husband build walls around himself so high and so thick that she'd stopped trying to find the door. And now here he was, holding a stranger's broken toy like it was the first gentle thing that had touched him in 7 years. "Maybe," she said carefully, "the universe is trying to tell you something." He didn't answer, but he didn't put the rabbit down either. If a story like this is reaching you tonight, it might be reaching you for a reason. Make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next is the moment 2 broken families quietly begin to heal each other, and you won't want to miss it. Weeks passed. Do-hyun found himself returning to the same garden more often than his schedule strictly required, telling himself it was simply a peaceful place to think between meetings. Si-hwa noticed. She said nothing, but she noticed everything these days, the way his shoulders sat a little looser, the way he'd started humming, almost inaudibly, while getting dressed in the morning. She had grieved Ha-yoon alongside him every single day for 7 years, but grief had touched them differently. Where he had gone quiet and distant, she had thrown herself into small routines, tending the garden roses Ha-yoon once loved, keeping her daughter's room exactly as it was, as though preserving it carefully enough might keep the ache from spreading any further. She had learned, slowly, to live around the hollow place her daughter left behind. She had never once expected her husband to find his way out of it, and some nights she'd lain awake wondering if she'd married a man who would simply stay lost for the rest of his life. So when she noticed the humming, she said nothing, because she was afraid that numbing it might scare it away. She only watched and hoped, and let herself believe carefully, quietly, that something was changing. One evening, she suggested they go out together, just the two of them, for the first time in longer than either wanted to admit. They walked through the same garden, bought ice cream from a small cart near the entrance, and sat on a bench beneath the trees. The evening air was warm, carrying the smell of cut grass and the faint sweetness of the blossoms lining the garden path. Children's laughter drifted from somewhere near the fountain. Siwa found herself watching her husband more than the scenery, the way his shoulders had settled, the way he let the silence between them sit comfortably instead of filling it with business, the way he actually seemed to be looking at things instead of simply passing through them. "I'd forgotten what this felt like," she admitted quietly. "Just sitting somewhere with you, not because we had to." Do-hyun didn't answer right away. He was watching a group of children chase pigeons across the grass, scattering them into brief, startled flight. "I'd forgotten too," he said finally. "I think I forgot a lot of things these past few years. I'm only now noticing what I stopped paying attention to." That's when Do-hyun saw her, the little girl in the yellow dress, now trading it for a striped one, chasing a butterfly across the grass with the single-minded joy only children seem to possess. He watched her for a long moment before rising and crossing the lawn. He crouched down to her eye level and held out his half-finished ice cream cone. "Would you like some?" The girl considered it seriously, the way she seemed to consider everything, then shook her head. "Mommy says I shouldn't take things from people I don't know." And with that, she turned and scampered back toward her mother, pigtails bouncing. Do-hyun straightened, oddly touched by the refusal rather than offended by it, and returned to Siwa's side. "That's her," he said quietly, and something in his voice made Siwa look at him more closely, not the flat, controlled tone he used for business, but something almost unguarded. "That's the little girl who gave me Nunu." Siwa slipped her hand into his. "Then let's go say thank you properly," she said, and together, for the first time in 7 years, they walked toward something instead of away from it. Together, they crossed the lawn toward the mother and daughter. As they approached, the little girl's face lit up with recognition, and she tugged urgently on her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, it's him. It's the sad man from before." Jae-woo looked up and her breath caught as she placed his face. "Oh, it's you. I remember now. Seo-yeon talked about you for days." She offered an embarrassed, apologetic laugh. "I hope she wasn't a bother giving away her favorite toy like that." "She wasn't a bother at all," Do-hyun said, and something in his voice, steady, sincere, entirely unlike the man who negotiated in boardrooms, made Jae-woo relax. "She gave me something I didn't know I needed." Introductions followed. Siwa found herself charmed within minutes by Jae-woo's easy warmth and by Seo-yeon's fearless, open-hearted chatter. The two women exchanged a look that mothers seem to share instinctively, a silent, mutual understanding that this meeting, however small, mattered. They didn't part as strangers that evening. Before they left, Siwa pressed a small business card into Jae-woo's hand, her personal number, not her husband's office line, and said simply, "I'd like to see you again. Both of you." Jae-woo turned the card over in her fingers the whole walk home, half convinced it would vanish if she looked at it too long. She was not a woman easily impressed by wealth. She'd cleaned enough marble floors in her lifetime to know money didn't make people kind. But there had been something in Siwa's eyes that had nothing to do with the mansion or the driver waiting at the curb. Something that looked, unmistakably, like a woman who needed a friend just as much as Jae-woo did. Over the following weeks, the garden became a meeting place. What began as a chance encounter turned into a standing, unspoken arrangement. Wednesday afternoons, the same bench ice cream that Seo-yeon now happily accepted since, as she reasoned with great seriousness, "We're not strangers anymore." Siwa found herself looking forward to these afternoons more than she expected, drawn to Jae-woo's quiet strength and to the particular, unfiltered joy that seemed to follow Seo-yeon everywhere she went. The two mothers became genuine friends, trading stories over paper cups of coffee, while Seo-yeon narrated increasingly elaborate adventures to a patiently listening Do-hyun. He, in turn, began asking Jae-woo questions about her daughter, how she'd raised such a fearless, generous child on her own, what her days looked like, whether she ever had help. Jae-woo answered honestly, without pride or self-pity, and Do-hyun found himself quietly, deeply respecting her. One Wednesday, while their wives walked Seo-yeon toward the duck pond, Do-hyun found himself alone on the bench with Jae-woo for the first time. He wasn't a man who made small talk, and he didn't attempt to now. "Your daughter," he said, "gave a broken toy to a stranger because she thought he looked lonely. Most adults wouldn't have noticed. Most adults who did notice wouldn't have done anything about it." Jae-woo smiled, watching Seo-yeon chase a duck twice her size along the water's edge. "She's never learned to be careful with her heart. I used to worry that the world would teach her to be, eventually. Every day it doesn't, I'm grateful." "Don't let it," Do-hyun said quietly. "The world has enough careful hearts already." He paused, choosing his next words with unusual difficulty for a man used to commanding rooms. "I had a daughter. She would have been about Seo-yeon's age now, if he stopped there, and Jae-woo, with the instinct of someone who had learned to read the edges of other people's grief, didn't push him to finish. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "Don't be." He watched Seo-yeon shriek with delight as the duck finally let her get close. "For 7 years, I thought I owed her my grief. I'm only now starting to understand that I might owe her my joy instead." Jae-woo said nothing, but something in her chest ached warmly on his behalf, and from that afternoon on, she found herself thinking of him not as the wealthy stranger her daughter had wandered up to in a garden, but as a friend. Around that same time, Sehwa began quietly finding ways to ease the weight Jae-woo carried alone, careful never to make it feel like charity. She recommended Jae-woo for a bookkeeping position at a small company she knew, better hours, better pay, work Jae-woo was more than capable of, but had never had the connections to reach. When Jae-woo protested that she couldn't accept help she hadn't earned, Sehwa simply said, "You earned it the moment your daughter decided a stranger's loneliness mattered more than her favorite toy. I'm only closing the loop." Jae-woo took the job, nervous and proud in equal measure, and within a month she was working days instead of split shifts, home in time to walk Seo-yeon back from school instead of leaving her with a neighbor until dark. It wasn't charity, Sehwa insisted, and in time Jae-woo came to believe her. It was simply what friendship looked like when one friend happened to have more room to give than the other. For Seo-yeon, the change meant something simpler and no less profound. Her mother was home for dinner now, every single night, and some evenings she was even too tired to notice that Nunu had been left, once again, propped against the salt shaker at the table, waiting to be greeted. After several weeks, Sehwa finally voiced what she and her husband had both been circling. "Would you and Seo-yeon like to come to dinner? At our home?" Jae-woo hesitated, glancing instinctively at the scale of the man beside her wife, the quiet authority he carried even in stillness. But Seo-yeon had already grabbed her mother's hand, eyes wide with excitement, and the answer decided itself. Before that dinner ever happened, though, Seo-yeon's 7th birthday arrived, a small, modest affair in the cramped apartment, a single-layer cake Jae-woo had stayed up late frosting after her second shift. To Jae-woo's quiet surprise, Sehwa and Do-hyun showed up at the door that evening, no driver waiting outside, no fanfare, just the two of them and a wrapped gift far too large for the apartment's narrow hallway. "You didn't have to," Jae-woo said, flustered, ushering them into a living room that suddenly felt very small. "We wanted to," Sehwa said simply and meant it. Seo-yeon tore into the gift with the ferocity only a 7-year-old could manage, and beneath the wrapping paper found a small wooden workbench, real tools, child-sized, the kind meant for learning to carve. She looked up at Do-hyun, confused. "So you can fix Nunu's leg someday," he explained, crouching beside her, "if you ever decide you want to, or so you can make her a friend. It's your choice. I just thought you should have the tools in case." Seo-yeon threw her arms around his neck without warning, and Do-hyun went still for a moment, the particular stillness of a man unused to being embraced by anyone smaller than himself. before, slowly, he let his arms come up around her in return. Her hair smelled faintly of the frosting she'd already got on her fingers, and her small arms held on with the complete, unguarded trust children extend before the world teaches them to measure it out more carefully. "Thank you," she said into his shoulder, muffled but clear. "This is the best birthday I ever had." He didn't trust his voice to answer right away, so he simply nodded against her hair and held on a moment longer than the hug strictly required. Across the room, Jai-woo caught Si-hwa's eye, and neither woman said anything because nothing needed saying. The mansion that had stood silent for 7 years filled, that evening, with the small, ordinary miracle of a child's laughter echoing off walls that had forgotten what laughter sounded like. Seo-yeon ran through the halls with unself-conscious delight, trailing Nunu behind her by one worn ear, stopping every few steps to marvel at a painting or a staircase or the enormous chandelier that scattered light across the foyer like scattered stars. "Mommy, look, it's like a castle," she called, spinning in a slow circle beneath it, and Jai-woo laughed despite herself, torn between embarrassment and the simple joy of watching her daughter be so unashamedly delighted. In the kitchen, the household staff paused mid-task to listen. An older housekeeper named Madame Choi, who had worked in the house since before Ha-yoon was born, set down the dish she was drying and pressed a hand to her chest. "Do you hear that?" she said softly to the younger maid beside her. "I haven't heard a child laugh in this house in 7 years." "Is that a good thing?" the younger girl asked. Madame Choi wiped at her eyes with the corner of her apron. "It's the best thing," she said. "It means the house is finally allowed to breathe again." At the table, Do-hyun sat at the head of a place that had felt too large for 2 people for 7 long years. Seo-yeon insisted on sitting beside him rather than beside her own mother, chattering the entire meal about her kindergarten teacher, a cat she'd once seen that she was certain could talk, and the correct way to eat soup without splashing, a rule she enforced on herself with great seriousness and immediately broke. Si-hwa watched her husband laugh, actually laugh, low and unguarded, at something Seo-yeon said about the talking cat, and had to excuse herself briefly to the kitchen, where she stood at the counter and let herself cry, quietly and gratefully, for the first time in years that weren't born of grief. When she returned, no one asked why her eyes were red. Jai-woo simply reached over and squeezed her hand under the table, and nothing more needed to be said between 2 women who had both, in their own ways, learned to carry more than they should have to alone. After dinner, Seo-yeon grew drowsy on the long sofa in the sitting room, fighting sleep with the particular stubbornness of a child who refused to admit the evening was ending. Jai-woo moved to carry her, but Do-hyun, almost before he realized he was offering, said, "Let me." He lifted her carefully, the way a man lifts something he hasn't held in a long time and isn't sure he remembers how, and carried her to the nearest guest room while the mothers finished their tea. He set her down gently, and as he pulled the blanket over her, her eyes fluttered half open. "Will you tell me a story?" she mumbled, already halfway back to sleep. Do-hyun hesitated only a moment before sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. "Once," he said quietly, "there was a rabbit who lost one of her legs. Everyone thought that meant she was broken. But it turned out she wasn't broken at all, she just knew something the other rabbits didn't. She knew that the most important parts of you are never the parts that can break." Seo-yeon was asleep before he finished, one small hand still curled loosely around the edge of the blanket. Do-hyun sat there a moment longer than necessary, watching her breathe, and when he finally rose and stepped into the hallway, he found Si-hwa standing there, having heard every word. She didn't say anything. She only took his hand, and they walked back to the sitting room together. For the first time in longer than Do-hyun could remember, the table didn't feel large at all. It felt, almost unbearably, like the beginning of something. We're getting close to the moment this whole story has been building toward. The moment a promise made 7 years ago is finally kept. If you've stayed with me this far, hit that like button, because you're about to understand exactly why Nunu mattered all along. Months pass the way seasons do, quietly, and then all at once. What had started as a single act of a child's kindness in a garden had grown into something neither family had expected. Two households, once separated by every wall money and grief could build, now woven together by Wednesday dinners, birthday parties, and the unhurried rhythm of real friendship. Do-hyun smiled now, not the practiced, diplomatic curve of the mouth he'd once used in negotiations, but something looser, easier, that arrived unbidden when Seo-yeon burst into a room or when Jae-woo said something dryly funny over dinner. His men noticed first, a lightness in his step, a patience he hadn't shown in years. Sihwa noticed it every single day, and every single day she was grateful for it in a way words couldn't quite hold. Even Madame Choi noticed the small changes accumulating around the house, fresh flowers appearing in the front hall that no one had ordered, because Do-hyun had started stopping at the market near the garden on his way home. A child's drawing, taped crookedly to the refrigerator, of a man and a rabbit standing beneath a sun with too many rays. A second chair, quietly added to the head of the dining table, because Seo-yeon had declared she and Do-hyun were co-captains of dinner and needed matching seats. One afternoon, Do-hyun's driver mentioned, carefully, that he'd never seen his employer laugh at anything before this year, not once in the 6 years he'd worked for the family. Do-hyun, catching the comment through the rearview mirror, only shrugged, though the corner of his mouth had already begun to lift. "Neither had I," he admitted. One evening, after Jae-woo and Seo-yeon had gone home, and the mansion had settled back into its familiar quiet, Do-hyun found himself standing before the glass display case in his study. The one that had, for years, held only a single framed photograph of a small girl with a gap-toothed smile. Beside that photograph now sat Nunu, still missing one front leg, still worn smooth from years of small, loving hands. He had never had it repaired, though he could have one word to any craftsman in the city, and the leg would be seamless again. But he found he didn't want it fixed. Its brokenness was, in some strange way, the whole point. He picked it up gently, turning it over in his hands the way he had that first day in the garden. He thought of his daughter's small hand in his, of her voice, weak but certain, "Daddy, promise you'll smile again." He thought of 7 silent years, of a house with no laughter, of a promise he had carried like a stone in his chest, certain he would never find a way to set it down. And then he thought of a 6-year-old girl in a faded yellow dress, walking up to the most feared man in Seoul without a hint of fear in her eyes, simply because she thought he looked lonely, and deciding, with the whole uncomplicated wisdom of childhood, that the kindest thing she could do was give him what she loved most. Do-hyun smiled, quietly, fully, without effort, the kind of smile that didn't need to be practiced because it had finally, after 7 long years, come home. He hadn't broken his promise after all. It had simply been waiting for the right small hands to help him keep it. Behind him, the study door creaked open. Sihwa stood in the doorway, watching him, and when he turned to face her, she saw it plainly for the first time in 7 years. The smile she had feared she might never see again, sitting easily and naturally on her husband's face, as though it had never truly left, only been waiting for permission to come home. "You look like yourself again," she said softly, crossing the room to stand beside him. "I feel like myself again," he admitted, setting Nunu gently back beside Ha-yoon's photograph. "I used to think keeping my promise meant I had to stop grieving her. I don't think that anymore. I think I can miss her and still smile. I think she'd actually prefer that." Sihwa slipped her hand into his. "She would," she agreed. "She always did like it best when you laughed." That night, for the first time in 7 years, Do-hyun walked down the hall to Ha-yoon's room and opened the door. He didn't turn on the light at first, just stood in the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the shapes of a childhood frozen in place. Then he stepped inside, sat down on the edge of the small bed, and for the first time since the funeral, let himself cry without trying to stop it. Not the grief of a man still drowning, but the grief of a man finally strong enough to feel it and still keep breathing afterward. When he finally rose to leave, he left the door open behind him. It stayed open every day after that. The following Wednesday, in the garden, Seo-yeon noticed something different the moment she saw him. She tilted her head, studying his face with the same open, unfiltered curiosity she'd shown the very first day. "You're not sad anymore," she said, not as a question, but as a simple observation of fact. Do-hyun crouched down to her eye level, the way he had the day he'd offered her ice cream, and for the first time, let her see the smile fully, wide, warm, entirely unguarded. "No," he said, "I'm not sad anymore, you helped fix that." Seo-yeon beamed, satisfied, exactly as she had the day she first pressed a broken wooden rabbit into his hands. "Nunu's good at fixing things," she said matter-of-factly, "even when she's a little broken herself." Do-hyun looked down at the small girl in front of him, the one who had walked up to the most feared man in Seoul without a shred of fear, simply because she thought he looked lonely, and thought that of all the truths spoken in boardrooms and back rooms across his entire life, none had ever landed as clearly or as truly as that one. Later that evening, as the garden emptied and the streetlights flickered on one by one, the two families walked together toward the parking lot the way they had a dozen times before, unremarkable now, ordinary, the way something rare becomes ordinary once it's given enough time to root. Seo-yeon rode on Do-hyun's shoulders the last stretch, Nunu clutched in one hand, narrating the shapes she saw in the darkening sky with the same fearless confidence she'd once used to walk up to a stranger on a park bench. Jae-woo watched them from a few steps behind, walking beside Seo-ah, and thought of the woman she'd been 2 years earlier, exhausted, stretched thin, certain that the only thing she and her daughter would ever have was each other. She hadn't been wrong, exactly. They had always had each other. She simply hadn't known yet how much room that could grow to hold. "Thank you," she said quietly to Seo-ah, "for that day in the garden, for letting your husband keep a rabbit instead of throwing it away." Seo-ah laughed, soft and genuine. "Thank your daughter," she said. "She's the one who decided a broken toy still had somewhere important to be." Ahead of them, Do-hyun's laughter rang out, easy, unguarded, entirely his own, as Seo-yeon insisted with great authority. That the cloud above them was shaped exactly like a rabbit with one missing leg. He didn't correct her. He simply looked up, found the shape she meant, and agreed that she was right. Somewhere in that ordinary evening, 7 years of silence had finally, quietly, come to an end, not with a single dramatic moment, but with the slow, patient accumulation of small ones, the way most real healing tends to arrive, one Wednesday afternoon at a time.
Thank you for watching.
Please like and share. Leave us a comment.
Subscribe to Story Raffine.
Bye!